let's start making our shelf. Here we have a 1x4, so it's 3/4 of an inch thick, and it is 3.5 inches wide. And our board here is fairly long. We want to start cutting this up into our pieces. Our first part we need is 18 inches long. So just like we did with our gumball machine, we're going to mark it at 18 inches. Use our square to transfer that across. Now this piece is 18 inches. That is bigger than what the bandsaw can cut. So what we're going to do is we're going to put this into a vise and use our handsaw, and we're going to cut a good distance away from that mark, just so I'm going to stay at least a 1/2 inch away, because some of us might cut at a funny angle and things will happen. So we want to stay away about a 1/2 inch. That way we can trim it up on the bandsaw and sand to our line. Here we are at the vise. I have the piece I want to keep clamped in and hanging off to the left, and then the piece I'm going to cut all the rest of my pieces out of is clamped in the vise on the right. So when I cut my piece out, what I want to keep is right here. So I'm going to cut on this side of my line. Make sure when you clamp this in the vise that you clamp it in a way that you're not going to cut into the table, you're not going to cut into the vise handle if it's hanging out. Just make sure there's nothing in the way. It's a clear cut. When we use our handsaw here, this saw will cut when you push, not when you pull back. And another thing you want to be aware of is these saws, kind of hard to show on camera here, but this saw has been used for many years, and it does have a little bit of a bend to it. That bend, slight curve, that curve is going to make it hard for me to pull this saw through. So just so you're aware of that. And the teeth are getting a little bit wore out so that it doesn't cut as thick of a kerf. The material the saw blade removes is called the kerf. This doesn't remove a lot of kerf anymore. So I'm going to position my blade here so it's about a 1/2 inch away from my line. And then using a big long stroke, I'm going to cut all the way through this piece of wood here. Another thing to be aware of, if you bend your saw blade as you're trying to push or pull it through, it's going to make it very, very hard to push or pull it. Make sure you're pushing very, very straight with the blade. The blade should not be curved at all. When you get close to the end of your cut like this, hold your piece up so it doesn't snap and break off. If it breaks, you're going to be wasting a lot of material. So now, without much pressure, I'm going to try to cut that little tab off on the bottom without it breaking off. If it breaks off, you're going to have to waste a lot of material. So there is my 18-inch board. Now I'll take it over the bandsaw, cut it a little bit long on my line, sand it to the line. We're only going to waste that little tiny bit. On this piece here, we're going to square this up on the sander. I'll scribe a line, sand my line, square it up on the sander, and then we'll measure out our next pieces. We just cut out our top at 18 inches. Now what we're going to do is we're going to cut out these two pieces at the same time, because these two, we're going to make 2 of these brackets. They're smaller and can fit on the bandsaw. So we're going to cut a piece that's 22 inches long now. Taking my ruler here, tape measure, I bring it over to 22.5 inches. Sorry, 22 inches, not 22.5, 22 inches right there. That is where I'll scratch my line and cut. There we go. And this one, I gave myself an extra inch, so I'm going to cut fairly close to that line and then sand to the line. I have my project cut out to 22 inches and squared on both ends. Now what we're going to do is we are going to create our bracket. So if we look at our bracket here, there aren't many dimensions for it on our drawing. All we have is it says to trace the bracket template to create. Here is the shelf bracket template or pattern. I'm going to take this pattern, I'm going to place it down here in this corner. Make sure it's flush all the way around. This is where it's very important that this end is square. If the edge of your piece of material here is not square, your shelf is going to sit at a funny angle. So all we need to do is line it up. We're going to trace it. Take our template, we're going to flip it around now, and we're going to place it fairly close, about a 1/4 inch in between. Make sure it's flush on the backside, and we are going to trace it again. To keep this square, I don't trust myself enough to make sure I have this on here square. All I did was mark the backside. So I had this on here, I traced the curve. I put a mark on the backside here, or I guess that is the top of the bracket. I put a mark there, and then I'm going to use my square to make sure it is square. I don't want to guess. I want to make sure the thing is square so my shelf stays nice and square. There we go. Now, this distance, if we look at our print, that distance is for your back of your shelf, and this is the one where you're going to create your own design by taking 2 pieces of paper, taping them together, marking out 14.5 by a 3.5 inch rectangle, and then cutting that rectangle out, and inside that rectangle you're going to fold it in half, draw your design on 1/2 of it, cut it out like a snowflake, and when you unfold it, it's going to be symmetric. So that is what you're going to do with that design. It just has to be the full height on the sides and fairly close to the full height in the center. That way it has the most strength. But just to make sure I have that amount of distance, I'm going to mark it out 14.5. So this end is squared up. My right end is squared up. I'm going to mark out 14.5. Use my square, square it up. So you can see here that I have about 1 3/4 inches of scrap material here that we are going to cut through with the bandsaw. Now we're going to take this over to the bandsaw. Remember, this section right here is scrap, so I'm going to cut just barely on the inside of my line here, and then I'll sand it square. I'm going to cut barely on this side of my line here, and then sand this piece square. And then eventually we'll get to the point where we'll cut in between these, being very careful not to cut into any of our lines. We'll cut close to our lines, and then we'll sand them using the spindle sander and the belt sander.